Hello, my name is Nicole Gray, and this is my presentation on effects of technology on Title I Middle School Music Student Achievement. So it's important to understand kind of what I was thinking before I settled on a research topic. I knew that I would be completing this study during the COVID-19 pandemic, implementing and creating this study. So I wanted to make sure that the study could be conducted over the internet because my students, most of them were learning virtually at the time. I've always been curious about this push for more technology integration into K-12 education. Being a devil's advocate, I question, is adopting a more technology-based curriculum more for show, or does it actually improve test scores, student learning? And then finally, I wanted to make sure that my study was relevant to both me and my students. My students come from a Title I school, so I wanted to be able to research if technology could help Title I students achieve higher scores. So the overall purpose of my study, I came to this question of what effect does technology have on student achievement in middle school music class? There is a lot of literature that came before my study, but a few to point out that were very important in my research. Prensky in 2001 published a book where he coined the term digital native. A digital native is a person who grows up using technology, but also thinks and processes in different ways compared to those who he coined as digital immigrants. So a digital immigrant would be an older adult, a grandparent, while a digital native is more comfortable using technology. The digital immigrant never quite reaches the fluency that a digital native has. Another study that is worth noting is Becksted's 2001 study, where Becksted suggests that technology can facilitate learning. Specifically, the study focused on students composing without an extensive knowledge of standard notation, using synthesizers, computers, MIDI keyboards, that the students didn't really need to know all of the traditional music notation knowledge to be able to create and compose for themselves. Specifically, that the technological features of recording and playback features were very important in that process. Another study that's worth noting is Albert's 2020 study that took place in a middle school music technology class. This study more so focused on technology giving the freedom, creativity, and leadership opportunities to students. So the study mentioned how students felt more comfortable being creative and taking on leadership roles because they felt like they could teach the class something about technology that maybe the teacher wasn't extremely comfortable with. So there was give and take where the students would become the teacher and where the teacher would kind of step back from that leadership role, all facilitated through technology. Another idea that came up quite a bit in the literature review were student or educator perspectives of using technology in the classroom. Now, the research that I found was extremely mixed, meaning some people were very interested in using technology in the classroom, where maybe older teachers were very uncomfortable with it. They felt like they didn't have enough training. Specifically, though, what I saw again and again was those that were more likely to use technology were those that had prior experience, like the digital natives. Growing up using technology, you're more likely to use it in the classroom. Other things that popped up as well, the idea of personality types. So if you are more extroverted, outgoing, maybe more of a risk taker, you're more likely to use technology in the classroom compared to introverts that are more shy, not as outgoing, don't want to take those risks because they don't want technology to fail in front of their students. This next section I call supplemental technology. This means music programs, websites, videos that are helpful in aiding instruction. So Petty and Henry in 2014 studied vocal sight reading achievement in beginning choir students using smart music. Now, there were no significant differences found when analyzing the test scores between those who used smart music and those that didn't. The data showed that when the students began first sight reading, actually taking the pretest, that the scores were very low. So the overall mean scores were less than 6 points out of 24. Meanwhile, the post-test scores had a mean of an increase of 143% with mean scores of just over 14. So a huge increase. But the study suggested that students with prior piano experience or just music instruction in general scored higher than the students that did not have that experience. So suggesting that maybe just prior exposure to any type of music instruction is more likely to help future music testing. Another study that was influential in my research was DeWitt et al. 2013. They surveyed instructors and lecturers in fine arts about their feelings about YouTube. Now, these lecturers and instructors ended up saying that YouTube, though it's a great resource, it cannot and should not replace face-to-face instruction, specifically because when there's a professor or an instructor in the room, they can give you immediate feedback to correct anything that might be going on. But with a YouTube video, excuse me, you're kind of just going by yourself and you don't know if you're quite doing all of the right technique. So though YouTube is a great instructional resource as an addition on top of face-to-face instruction, it shouldn't replace that one-on-one time with an instructor. And then finally, to end the literature review section, access to technology was a big concern throughout the literature review. So for example, there were many districts that had lots of funding. Every student was paired with a computer or an iPad. Meanwhile, there were some districts that did not have those resources. So it was extremely mixed, especially when you zoomed in and looked at the music programs. Sometimes the music programs were one-to-one with a device, a computer, iPad, whatever. And then other times maybe the school had one-to-one, but there were shared resources for the music classes. So again, access to technology was extremely mixed. So the research questions. Question number 1, is there a difference in student performance between students who learn with or without supplemental technology? Adding on to that, my research question 2, where do those differences occur, specifically in the independent variables that I'll speak about in just a little bit? And then finally, what are the effect sizes when analyzing significant interactions between technology use and student performance? So my participants, out of 65 possible students, I had to eliminate 18 scores from the overall data analysis set due to either students not completing the pre-test before instruction or not completing the post-test after or before I was analyzing the data. So that left me with 47 middle school students. These students came from grades 8 and 7. Also, the students were from, I teach both band and orchestra at my school, so I taught 4 sets of groups for this study. So a band and an orchestra class for 8th grade, and then a band and an orchestra class for 7th grade. And again, these students are coming from a Title I designated school. Specifically, the demographics look like 99% Black students, and then about 99% are on free or reduced lunch as well. The research design. So I used a quasi-experimental design using a pre-test and post-test for collecting my data. I had to keep the students within their classroom structure, the classes in which they were enrolled in, so I was not able to randomize the students, so one big group as a whole would receive one type of instruction, meanwhile the other groups would receive the other instruction. The pre-tests and post-tests were to create a baseline, so I asked the students to complete a pre-test to understand where student knowledge was at, and then later compared to the post-test. The independent variables were instruction type. So instruction type either meant regular instruction, which I'll speak about in a little bit, and then supplemental technology instruction. So those were the 2 different ways that I taught the students. Again, grade levels, students either came from grades 8 or 7. And then classroom enrollment, that means either students were in the band or orchestra class. The dependent variables were the scores on the pre-test and post-test. Again, the pre-test scores were to create a baseline, and then post-test to see how students improved from that pre-test to the post-test. The students answered questions for the pre-test and the post-test in Google Forms. Students have been very comfortable using Google Forms to submit homework as well as attendance records, so I thought I would keep it the same. As you can see on the screen, students answered questions about rhythm counting for the pre-test and post-test. These rhythm examples were taken from Georgia Music Educator Association, music examples, as well as similar rhythms to what we've learned in class. In class, we learned symbol notation for what the specific symbols on the screen mean. So for example, the plus signs are the ands of eighth notes. For longer notes such as half notes and whole notes, the students would need to understand that a dash in between the numbers meant that those notes were connected. Instruction type. So all groups received the following. All groups, the 4 that participated in the study, received 50-minute instruction every other day. A typical day of class looked like information that was presented in Google Slides. The first few minutes of class, I would play some music, we would talk about it. The next portion of class, we would review and/or learn something new. And then the last chunk of class, students would either complete homework or participate in activities. For this study, there were 2 different instruction types. So in addition to what all groups received, the regular instruction group, they were to answer and engage in questions over the Zoom chat and to unmute themselves on the microphone. Compare this to the supplemental instruction with technology. This group, the experimental group, used Nearpod, Kahoot, and watched YouTube videos. Nearpod is a website where educators can create interactive slides where you can directly embed questions, mini games, things like that into the content. Kahoot is a website where you can create any sort of game. So I created rhythm counting games for the students. And then YouTube videos, we watched rhythm counting videos. So the data analysis, how I actually analyzed all of the scores. So scores were collected from the pre-test and the post-test. Each pre-test and post-test totaled up to a score of 10 points. I calculated the mean of the scores as well as the standard deviations across scores. I specifically used IBM SPSS, and the type of analysis I used was analysis of covariance, or ANCOVA. This graph is showing us the distribution of test scores from the pre-test and the post-test. The pre-test is in blue. You can see at the bottom here is where the scores are. So you can see generally the scores were pretty low for the pre-test, and then for the post-test, the scores were much higher. So we can see that 20 people scored a score of 10 on the post-test. Meanwhile, how many scored 10 on the pre-test? It looks like maybe about 6 people. So that's a pretty good jump from 6 people scoring 10 total points to 20 people scoring 10 total points for the post-test. The results. So answering our first research question, is there a difference in student performance between students who learn with or without supplemental technology? So I first answered this question by using a ANCOVA. What I found was that there was no significant between group differences. Specifically for instruction type, the p-value equaled 0.540. The grade level, so 8th grade or 7th grade, the p-value was 0.177. And then class enrollment, the p-value was 0.973. So none of these independent variables, instruction type, regular versus experimental or the supplemental, grade level, 8th grade versus 7th grade, and class enrollment, band versus orchestra. None of those groups, none of the between group differences were found to meet the threshold of p equals 0.05. So there were no significant between group differences. So taking a look at this next table, I wanted to zoom in to just take a look at the mean scores and the standard deviation between the groups. In the table, you can see that there's an acronym here. SIT means Supplemental Instruction with Technology. That's our experimental group. Meanwhile, the regular instruction, that could be considered the control group. So taking a look first off, we can see that our 8th grade mean scores were around the 6s, with 8th grade orchestra getting into, kind of the higher 6s area. Then compare those mean scores to their post-test mean scores. We can see that 7th grade jumped up to 8, and then our 8th grade jumped up to 8.75, so 8th grade orchestra almost getting to that 9 area. Compare that to the 7th grade scores. Again, we're sitting around that 5 area. Compare them with the mean scores to the post-test. We jump up to 7. And then we see 7th grade orchestra here, just below 7 there. So the second research question, where do the differences occur? Well, because none of the independent variables met the threshold of p equals 0.05, a post hoc LSD was not computed because there were no significant between group interactions. Same can be said with the third research question. What were the effect sizes when analyzing these significant interactions? Well, there were not significant interactions. So therefore, the effect sizes were not computed because the p-value, again, was not met. All the p-values were way too high. The discussion. So again, to answer each pretty briefly here, is there a difference between student performance, between students who learn with or without supplemental technology? Looking at the p-values, no, we did not see a significant difference. None of those values met p equals 0.05. They were way too high. Same can be said with, did differences occur? Where did they occur? And then for effect sizes, these couldn't be computed because the p-values were very high. They did not meet the threshold of p equals 0.05. The discussion. So something to keep in mind is we saw that the 8th grade scores were much higher overall than the 7th grade scores. So a few things to think about. Possibly this means that 8th graders have more exposure overall to learning rhythms compared to the 7th graders. They've been in school for one more year compared to the 7th graders. It could be that the 7th graders scored higher overall because they are developmentally more advanced than the 7th graders. For example, maybe they are more comfortable using technology compared to the 7th graders. And then it's possible that the 8th graders could focus better online compared to the 7th graders. Again, this idea that they have another year in school, they are more advanced developmentally. So maybe that contributed to the 8th graders scoring higher on the pre-test, post-tests compared to the 7th grade. Enrollment type did not impact achievement scores. So enrollment being band versus orchestra did not have an impact on overall scores. Again, the p-values were found to not be significant. So with enrollment type across the data set, we saw that the p-value for enrollment type band versus orchestra was 0.973. So that was not significant. And then similarly, the instruction type, the experimental supplemental instruction with technology versus regular instruction. Instruction type was not found to be significant with a p-value of 0.540. So it's important to talk about some of the limitations of the study. First off, the study was conducted online during a pandemic, so I ran into a handful of problems. For example, I was bound to the school schedule. At my school, sometimes we had a professional development day, sometimes there were holidays. So there were a few weeks where I only saw one set of classes one day a week, meaning that there was a lot of time in between their last class and then the next one to continue this study. So the duration of the study really varied depending on what day of the week that they had class. Specifically, sometimes students were having technology issues, they weren't attending very consistently. Those were some things I ran into. As well as I had to exclude 18 students from the overall results, bringing my overall pool down from 65 students all the way down to 47. So some ideas for future research include conducting the same study but in person. You could also change the type of technology being used. Maybe it's MIDI keyboards, using iPads compared to computers. So there's a lot you could do differently just conducting the study in person. Also, you could conduct this study using a different topic. My topic happened to be rhythm counting, perhaps musical genres, even some performance aspect like playing a scale could be a better topic or a different topic. And then the class type could change, such as conducting the study in a general music setting or even a choir setting. Some implications of the research. So I found that both instruction types did increase test scores. So looking at the regular instruction as well as the supplemental instruction with technology, the pre-test and post-test scores all increased their mean overall scores. So that's to suggest that both instruction types do increase test scores. It's possible that band and orchestra students do learn in similar ways. I read a research article that suggested that band students are more likely to learn by rote, while orchestra students are more likely to learn written rhythms and are able to learn music better that way. Well, my data suggested that class enrollment, the p-value was too high. That suggested that class enrollment did not have an effect on test scores. I think too, looking at the test scores from 8th grade to 7th grade suggests that we always need to keep in mind the developmental level of our students. The 8th graders scored a little bit higher overall compared to the 7th graders, regardless of the instruction type. So maybe those 8th graders need less repetitions. They can move on to a new topic in your music class, while the 7th graders might need more repetitions of varied activities to learn a topic at hand. And then finally, going back to the main idea of the study, technology in the classroom, my data suggests that technology could be a useful addition to instruction. Going back to implication number 1, both instruction types increase test scores. My data doesn't suggest that technology is any better or any worse than instruction that isn't incorporating technology, but that to keep in mind, technology might hold some interest for students. Maybe students that learn better by looking at a video, interacting in different ways, but my data does not suggest learning with technology is any better or any worse than regular instruction. Thank you so much for watching.